Hi, listeners. So last night I read part one of Zombies in Aberdeen, and today I'm going to read part two for you. I think it's a little shorter than part one. Could be about the same length. I don't really. I've never read it out loud, so I don't know. So part one, we heard about Miles and Martina and sorry, Millie. It's morning. I'm drinking coffee. Millie, Styles, Martina, and Curtis making it to Aberdeen, and Millie gets shot because she is mistaken for a zombie. And her hair is really wild and big, and they had to stagger in there because they'd been running 10 miles. So, we are going to learn more about why zombies just can't stay in Aberdeen today, and we're going to come to the conclusion. And this is, like I said, this is the second zombie story I have ever written, which is hilarious because I don't really like watching or listening to zombie stories. I have a big ick factor about like guts and stuff on TV, which is hilarious for a fantasy and sci-fi and sometimes horror writer, but it's true. So I am going to go ahead and read, and hopefully you like it. Let's see. Okay, here we are. The next 2 days were a blur of faces staring down upon her in a mixture of worry and boredom. Though she was too weak to say it, she was a little annoyed with the fact that Styles looked bored watching over her. "You're alive and unshot, asshole." But she didn't have the energy to say that. So she stored it inside for when she was fully functioning, which happened to be only a couple days later. She opened her sandy eyes and smacked her dry lips together. She looked about the room to see who was sitting with her, but found herself alone. "Guess the threat of my death is over, and they've found something more interesting to occupy themselves with," she thought bitterly. She attempted to sit up and failed several times. The pain in her shoulder was excruciating. She looked down at her cleanly bandaged wound and bit her lip over the pain as she forced her abs to pull her up. You never know how connected all your muscles are until you're shot in one of them. The movement sent a searing pain up her entire arm and through her chest. "You could just relax, you know." The voice startled Millie into turning too quickly, which she immediately regretted. Tears sprung to her eyes. "Oh, geez. Bad choice. Oh, God, sorry. I didn't mean to startle you." His voice was a warm tenor. He stood by an open door in what seemed to be a small clinic. She looked down and noticed that she was sitting on a flat medical bed. She wished she could smooth her hair or look less like a wind-blown, dirt-caked mess, but it wasn't happening. She gave up her mini-crush on the stunning, mopey youth who shot her, and decided she was too old and too hurt to care. "It's fine. Being post-apocalypse makes one jumpy. Probably the same reason you shot me. Where's my husband? The Martins?" The young man came into the clinic room, walked to her bed, and adjusted a lever on the back of it, lifting the bed so she could relax against it while sitting. "Is that better?" She nodded. "Thank you." "Your husband is on patrol duty. The Martins are setting up an apartment, but Martina said she'd be back to check on you soon." "Oh, okay." She was too dizzy to come up with anything more intelligent to say. "Are you feeling good enough to eat? We have you on fluids." He pointed to an IV stuck into her arm. "But you'll probably feel better when you can eat. I brought some applesauce." The shaggy-haired youth pulled a packet of applesauce from his overlarge gray zip-up. He shook his long bangs away from his stormy eyes for a moment, and Millie finally figured out why she was so dumbstruck over the young man. "You're not that much younger than me, are you? You just look it. I put you about 20. Maybe the eyeliner, I don't know." The young man shrugged. "I don't know how old you are, so I don't know. I'm 27. Millie's eyes grew wide and her heart pounded in her ears. Just like Kurt. No, it couldn't be. He's dead. The only dead that come back in this life are zombies, and this guy is no zombie. But another thought battled her reason. If zombies are a thing, why not this? Clearly all of this had been too much for her brain, daydreaming about a dead grunge star. Pathetic. But she said none of that, only held out her hand for the applesauce packet. The uncanny youth frowned over her expression, but handed her the packet. He didn't say anything when she made sure to touch his rough fingertips, calloused as though worn from plucking taut strings. But he grinned, a pull at the side of his mouth, as if he knew what she was doing. His fingertips were as solid and textured as any real person's. If she felt a little weak from the contact, it was only because she was dizzy from loss of blood, or so she told herself. Sorry, I didn't catch your name before you passed out, after you shot me looking like a zombie. The man smiled for real this time, and it was a beautiful smile. His cheeks creased in a pleasing and familiar way. His eyes brightened, though they still held a vivid sadness. I'm really sorry about that. Your husband took the liberty of cleaning you up, and I can see I was mistaken. My name's Colby. Yours is Millie, right? Millie clasped his hand a little too eagerly, her small hand shaking in her small palm shaking inside his grip. She was thankful at that moment for her caring husband, who thought to clean her up. You don't look like a Colby. Colby shrugged. You don't look like a Millie. Millie's an old white lady's name, and you're not old or white. Millie laughed. Good point. I'm originally from Hawaii, the island of Lanai. Millie was my white grandmother's name, so you're not far off. Colby nodded. Ah, and why did you leave Hawaii for the rainy northwest? I wanted to live in the pines, where the sun don't ever shine. Millie raised an eyebrow at Colby. Colby didn't seem shocked or bothered by the comment. He simply smiled and said, a woman after my own heart. Anyway, you better try eating. I'm up to take over her styles anyway. See you around, Millie. Wait! And her shock over Colby's uncanny resemblance to her favorite grunge heartthrob, Millie forgot to ask the most obvious question. Why did the horde stop? Why won't they come in Aberdeen? Colby's laugh was a forced, angry chuckle. Would you come in to Aberdeen if you didn't have to? Millie frowned. Well, no, but I'm not a zombie willing to stumble around for miles after warm-blooded meal either. I doubt zombies care how lame Aberdeen is. Colby shrugged, resigned. There doesn't seem to be any other reason. Those who started out in Aberdeen like me have been watching them. The moment they near the city limits of Aberdeen, they back off. Their groans change. Even their faces look different. Millie remembered thinking the same thing when she scanned the undead before she passed out. Yeah, they seemed sad. Colby shook his head. Not just sad, depressed. Aberdeen depresses the shit out of the undead. Honestly, it's pretty depressing for the living too, but the zombies won't come near it, not even to eat. The zombies that do hang around, staring at us on the other side, they're changed somehow. We sit sentry not because we think the hordes will change their minds and finally come across. I mean, we're prepared for that, but really it's more of an experiment. The dead that hang out near Aberdeen lose their zombie instinct. They wail and wither and die. Waiting for us, I think, or maybe not. I really don't know why they stay. He leaned toward Millie, who suddenly realized her mouth was hanging open unattractively. She closed it. He continued in an intense whisper. An old woman died last week from pneumonia. We tried to get her the right antibiotics, but we're running too low, and she told us not to waste them on her. She refused to take them. She was a good woman. Colby's shoulders fell as if he were carrying the weight of her death. She changed like we all do when we die. We knew she was going that night, so we put her in a house near the border of the city, handcuffed her to the bed to keep her secured. Zombies aren't real nimble with their fingers, as you know. Millie nodded. What happened? Colby frowned. When she turned, she went crazy. We heard her scream. Have you ever heard a zombie scream? He shivered. Millie shook her head, her face horrified. Well, you don't ever want to. She screamed for at least an hour, then the sentry watched the house, heard the glass break. The guy ran down there to subdue her, keep her from making a shamble town out of the only safe place left in the U.S. But when he got there, he stood only feet away from her. He pulled his rifle out and waited for her to run at him. He said the hunger was evident. It was there. She stared him down, licking her lips, just before she cried out. That's what he said, cried out. Colby's storm-cloud eyes were distant. He said it was the most haunting sadness he'd ever heard. Then she turned from him, a perfectly good zombie snack, and ran across the border, wailing until she was past the limits. She stays there, just outside of Aberdeen. That handless zombie, staring forlornly at every sentry who sits to watch. But she's not like watching us out of hunger, or I don't think so. I don't know how to explain it. But she seems worried about us. She was so serious about getting out of the town that she tugged until her hand separated from her body. He stood to leave. Safe to say, zombies hate Aberdeen. Over the next 2 weeks, it was clear to Millie that Colby was right. It had taken her a couple more days to heal enough to carry a rifle, but when she did, she had to take position along one of the many posts along the wall. She got her turn playing Zombie Watch. She wasn't sure which was more depressing, watching zombies waste away to nothing, or being in a town where even the houses frowned. She pointed this reverie out to Styles when he'd shown her their new apartment. It was situated in an old house along the main residential stretch in Aberdeen. She stood at the foot of the house and stared at it for a couple of minutes before figuring out why it gave her the creeps. The white porch sagged in the corners and bowed in the middle. She eyed the house along the street and found that they all dipped in that familiar way. The houses are frowning. Even the houses are sad here. The ones that weren't sad, the nicer houses of Aberdeen, were stuck in the 70s and garishly painted. They are the first ones to be taken up by more established residents. Many of the houses weren't complete enough to frown. Those were falling apart, rotting, faded, or boarded over. Even the boarded-over meth houses had to be used as more and more people came for sanctuary. Many of them still functioned as meth houses, in fact, for as long as the ingredients to brew the smelly shit lasted anyway. Millie was just thankful she didn't live too closely to one of those places. The people living there weren't undead, but they might as well have been. They were rotting in much the same way, their teeth and hair falling out, their skin blistering and scabbed, their body fat burning up. The residents weren't the only desperate thing about Aberdeen. The local stores, restaurants, bars, and homes had all been combed over. The town's supplies were brought to what used to be a farm store and were divided out evenly among the families every week. The fresh fruit and vegetables had been eaten long ago, and the gardens in Aberdeen were miserable little affairs, stifled by a lifetime of industrial air surrounded by hot pavement. Some survivors spent their time trying to perk the happy gardens up, watering, de-weeding, and feeding them fertilizer from the farm store, but they remained spindly, drooping crops no matter what. The residents of Aberdeen would not be eating fresh food anytime soon. By the way, that barking you hear in the background, that's my chickens. I'm going to go fix that and shut the window real quick. Sit tight. Thank you. They like to be noisy in the morning. Well, they like to be noisy all day, really, but that's okay. Millie had driven through Aberdeen before the apocalypse and supposed that the browning grass and lackluster gardens stemmed from a lack of funds and the time to attend yards. Now she wasn't so sure. Time was an abundant commodity now, and money was a thing of the past. It was as if the air in Aberdeen was bogged down, even without the dead smokestacks clogging the air. She could feel the air weigh on her as she stalked cracked sidewalks and paced potholed streets. The town wasn't desperate because of the people who lived here. The people were desperate because of the town. Unfortunately, the only way to survive was to become accustomed to living in a town that dragged, from the skinny brown trees to the broken windows. The ocean roared several miles away, but you wouldn't know it from the confines of this stagnant town. You couldn't smell it in the air. The air was trapped in a concrete bubble. Millie was trapped. Sometimes, when sitting watch at the outskirts of town, she daydreamed about shooting a path through the horde and running until she reached the frigid rolling waves of the Pacific. She'd run a marathon before, and it had to be a shorter distance than that. But the horde was too massive, and they stayed firmly glued to the outskirts of Aberdeen. They were probably hoping that the people inside would eventually do just what Millie thought of doing every day. Their woeful faces and glazed eyes looked, just as Colby relayed, apologetic. Not so much for themselves, but for the sentries inside the city. The zombies seemed to feel bad for her in the same way that humans feel sorry for two cramped chickens and cows living in their own feces in farm factories. They'd still eat her if she ran for it, but she was sure they'd feel happy she got a chance to stretch her legs first, free-range style. Millie saw the no-handed zombie on her 5th watch day. Most of the zombies walked back and forth, stumbling along the border looking somber, sometimes reaching out toward the city limit and drawing their hand back as if stung. Not that zombie. She just stood and stared. As her skin melted away and her bones became exposed, she stared and wailed and looked so forlorn that Millie almost wanted to hold her. Only that would be disgusting and eventually painful. She knew she wouldn't run for the same reason she hadn't tried leaving the treehouse before Style suggested it. She wanted to live. Even so, she stood on the edges of Aberdeen most days, looking past the pacing undead toward the wild, furious Pacific. Stiles had grown used to his wife's obsessive routine and had, for the first 2 weeks, collected her from the edge of town and guided her back to the frowning porch in the middle of the anguished city. Not tonight. Not for a few nights, actually. Lately, he'd chosen to visit the Martins instead, leaving his wife to wander home when or if she wanted to. Some nights she'd stumble home in a daze and Stiles would not be in their room. She'd ask the other residents where he was, and they'd look away, embarrassed. They'd mumble that he'd left earlier in the day and hadn't returned. "He's with Martina," was the unspoken response. Millie wanted to care. She wanted to worry about losing her husband, but she found herself too preoccupied with the plans of ziplining off the highway signs over the mass of starving zombies waiting for her to break free of the town that they hated. It might work. If I could catch something on the other side of the zombies, a tree, maybe Martina could lasso a pole. She might help. Millie mumbled her plan out loud, pacing down the row of sagging houses on her block under the lone light of the moon, and forgetting that Martina was probably sleeping with Stiles at this moment. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered but leaving. Might help with what? A voice from behind her prompted, a delicious tenor voice, the only voice holding her back. She turned to Colby, a blush coloring her cheeks. Colby's brows were drawn down over his stormy eyes, his perfectly clefted chin sunk in a little more when his lips were pursed in worry as they now were. "Oh, I was just..." She trailed off, embarrassed. "Thinking about leaving again?" "Yeah. I've thought about a zip line before, but there's really nothing to attach it to on the other side, or nothing I could reach anyway. I don't think that any of our trucks could make it through the horde, even weakened as they are. Most of the gas has run out anyway. Used it for generators to keep the frozen food fresh." Millie's heart fell to her stomach, and frustrated tears fell down her face. "I can't do it anymore, Colby. This place, it's not a haven, it's hell. I can't stay here with the meth heads, my cheating husbands, the Martins, who are sure I've lost my mind, and the living, scraping by in a town that's already dead. I can't live here. If I'm not mad already, I will be within a few days." "It's either that or the zombies, Millie." Colby put a warm hand on her trembling forearm. "Come back with me, for now. You don't need to make any decisions tonight." Millie swallowed hard. Her stomach felt fluttery and her face flushed. A ravenous feeling crept over her, a feeling she'd not felt since before the apocalypse. Certainly not something Stiles brought forth with his cautious touch and stony face. Stiles was a choice made in the throes of survival. The feeling was not this feeling was not about survival. This feeling was entirely animalistic. For a moment she wondered if she were dying, turning into one of the nameless horde, but when she met Colby's eyes, full of unvoiced sorrow, she saw the same hunger. And when their lips met, and their hands searched for each other, it felt as if they were finding something the apocalypse had taken from them. Now I have to find my place here. They gave over to their desperate feelings that night in plain sight of the scrambling, moaning undead of the border of Aberdeen. Their grunts of passion didn't sound much different than the moaning of the horde, and no one came to investigate. When they fell apart, exhausted and spent an hour later, Millie felt at peace for the first time since the apocalypse stole all normalcy. She lay in the crook of her young lover's arm and stared at the curve of his jaw, the 5 o'clock shadow, the way his sandy hair fell in angles over his careworn face. And she was sure, regardless of the improbability of it, that she was being held by her first grunge love, though his flannel had been replaced by a worn zipper jacket and sturdy farm store blue jeans. She wished they could have stayed naked and entangled for a bit longer, but summer was giving way to fall and the night was growing chill. Anyway, new sentries might happen upon them soon. She didn't really care if Styles found out about Colby, since she was sure he and Martina had moved past caring about her, but she'd rather not be found with her pants around her ankles, literally or figuratively. She pulled her clothes back in place, and they fell asleep in the lulling moan of the dwindling horde. The sun broke through the ever-present gloom of Aberdeen long enough to shine on their groggy morning faces and the dumb faces of the decaying shamblers. Millie blinked open her eyes and immediately met the accusatory stare of Styles and Martina. Millie? What's going on here? Styles did not even attempt to conceal the hurt in his voice. Meanwhile, Martina looked down at Millie and Colby in complete shock. Millie was immediately offended and defensive, as if Martina and Styles hadn't been doing the exact same thing for days, if not weeks now. Millie stood and crossed her arms, putting herself in between Styles and Colby. Styles was leaning toward her lover in a way he said he was ready for a square-off. "Oh, come off it, you two. I might have been out of it lately, but I know you've been seeing each other. And I didn't say anything. You do what you have to do to survive in this place, and I'll do what I have to do." Styles rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Millie, that's not what's going on. Yes, I've been going over to the Martins' house. We've been working on a new plan. We don't like it here any more than you do, but we haven't given up. I tried to get you involved, but you've been shut off since we first got here. You didn't respond when we talked to you, when we asked you what was wrong. We were sure you were going off the deep end. Martina, Curtis, and I have been planning a way out. I see you staring off toward the Pacific. You talk about it in your sleep. We were on our way to get out, while you've been running around acting just like them." He waved a dismissive hand at the interested zombies peering at the arguing snacks with great interest. "And now you're talking again? But waking up in the arms of a kid? Millie, you're 35 years old. Almost 36. Colby is 18. He's barely fucking legal." Martina hissed over his curse and put a steadying hand on Styles' arm. Millie shook her head, pointing to Martina's hand. "I'm not crazy. See how she's touching you? Whether you like it or not, I know you want to be together. And Colby is not 18. He's 27. He told me so when I was in the hospital. Just ask him. He'll tell you." She turned to Colby then, who was standing a little off, his head bowed sheepishly, his hands thrust deep in the pockets of his sweater. He spoke to a zipper when he did finally speak. "I'm sorry, Millie. I didn't know how old you were. You look really young. I thought you were like 30 or something. I liked you. I didn't want you to treat me like a kid. I am 18. I thought you knew I was lying and you just didn't mind." Styles glared at the youth. "We had a flippin' birthday party for him last week, Millie. You're off talking to yourself and staring past the horde like always." Millie looked from Styles to Martina and back again. Their faces were a mixture of anger, disgust, and pity. Any remaining love they held was either gone or was hidden inside the stronger emotions clearly displayed in their faces. She turned to Colby, uncomprehending. If what he said was true, then... She put a shaking finger under his chin and tilted it to the rare sun. She wished she hadn't. Had it been the shock of being shot? The painkillers in the hospital? The bad light last night? Her own broken brain? How had she ever thought Colby was older than 20? And the bright morning sun, his eyes held no great wisdom, no crow's feet from laughing or crying. And they were green, a dark hunter green, not the stormy blue of the Pacific. His face was rounder, less angled than she remembered. In the bright light, it was clear that his hair shone with brown, more brown than blonde. She backed away from him and knocked into Styles, whose face was filled with unspoken pain. Styles had blue eyes, but they were not the color of the Pacific on a cloudy day. The only good thing about Aberdeen was the fantasy she created. but her fantasy died in 1994. Aberdeen was nothing but a slow death. Kurt had known that all those years ago. Colby probably didn't even understand her references, the poor kid. He just wanted to have a little fun in the dead man's town. But Millie backed away from the awkward group, her husband, her only remaining friend, and her silly tryst. She turned from the hurt and desperation on their faces, turned away from the frowning, dying town, and ran past the city limits of Aberdeen. The smiling faces of the decaying horde greeted her. They extended their arms in welcome. Their melting skin was a beautiful brakish blue, the blue of the Pacific, which she could just smell over the decay. And even decay smelled better than Aberdeen. That, my friends, is the end of that story. So, like I said, kind of a weird story, but one of my favorite that I've written, which again is pretty funny since I don't really like zombie stories usually. I always thought, though, the most interesting thing about zombie stories are people's capacity. You can tell the people who are dealing well with stress in the stories and those who are just completely crumbling. And the idea that, how fragile would people be more so than usual under such stress. And so probably a lot of you are feeling fairly fragile. Many of you know that I wrote Monochrome, which is a book about postpartum depression and bipolar disorder, but mainly it's a fantasy book about depression. And so I hope that you're all taking care of yourselves. As somebody who knows depression and anxiety and fear very well, I pray that you're not running off into the waiting maws of zombie hordes, and instead you're doing things that bring you joy, like writing weird stories about how zombies don't like Aberdeen. I love you all, and have a great day.